Welcome back to Eschatology Matters. I'm your host, Josh Howard. If you have not already, please check out our website, eschatologymatters.org. You can find most of our information shared through that central website hub, as well as information on our upcoming conference. We have our annual conference coming up. That's going to be the Eschatology Matters annual conference. And our theme this year is How Then Shall We Live? Riffing a bit off of Schaeffer in that regard, how eschatology impacts the lived Christian experience and our worldview in this day and age. So check out the information on our website concerning the conference. You can find ticket information. It'll be September 8th and 9th in Topeka, Indiana. I would also, as always, encourage you, if you don't already, to be sure to subscribe, whether to our YouTube channel or to one of our podcast platforms. That way you can keep up with our content as it is continuing to come out. Today, we have the pleasure of doing one of our community spotlights, one of the organizations that is partnering with us in our ministry. And today I'm speaking with Iain Thompson, who is the manager of North American operations for Banner of Truth. So, Mr. Thompson, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's good to be here. It's good to be speaking with you, and good to be speaking to all the other people out there as well.
Yes, sir. Mr. Thompson, would you please just give us many of our listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with Banner of Truth. If you've been, especially within Reformed circles for any amount of time, you're going to come across Banner of Truth material. But would you give us a brief bio on yourself and kind of an introduction to where you are at?
Okay. My background really was in manufacturing industry, and I actually studied geology and physics at university. So it's not really a great setup for actually working in Christian publishing. But I first started working in Christian publishing about 28 years ago. And that was for a company based in northern Scotland called Christian Focus Publications. Many of your listeners may well have actually heard about that. Mm-hmm. But then I was tempted by the filthy lucre of America to actually come across the pond to work at Presbyterian Reform Publishing, and that was a great introduction to Reform publishing in the United States. And I've also worked at Reformation Heritage Books, but now I'm been working a year yesterday for Banner of Truth. So I've known the folks from Banner of Truth from my time in Scotland, and it's been great just to be working with them and alongside them, rather than just working in parallel with them, as it were, in other publishing ventures. But absolutely, it's been an interesting homecoming in one sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to ask you, about Banner of Truth, what differentiates them. But I want to make sure to mention first one of the volumes that we just got. Let me make sure it shows up on my camera there. One of the ones we just got from you guys was the Promise of the Future. We have spoken about this book before. Cornelis Venema, who is right down the road from where I am in Michigan. He's right down the road at Mid-America, but has written many helpful things. This is one of the volumes that we usually will recommend to people. It's such a good introduction. He's writing from an amillennial perspective. It's a book on eschatology, but one of the things that he does, which has been so valuable, is that he pairs a kind of whole Bible eschatology. He's drawing you, whether you agree with his amillennial perspective or not, he's drawing you into a view of eschatology that's much bigger than a chapter. He's looking at the whole flow of Scripture, which I find so helpful. Again, even if you don't necessarily agree with his individual camp, he's a welcome conversation partner. He engages other views without being overly polemical. Very, very good book. So I appreciate you guys sending that, and we would of course recommend that book. But thinking in those terms, Mr. Thompson, what differentiates Banner of Truth? You just mentioned you have a pretty good experience, pretty good grasp of Christian publishing. I've got some questions about that in general as well. But what differentiates Banner of Truth?
I guess the central difference would be that Banner operates really as a organization that serves its trustees. So the decisions in terms of which books are made or published, it tends to come down to the trustees making decisions on those. And I think it's a good safeguard in one sense. I mean, when you've worked at any period of time in Christian publishing, then you realize that there's always that danger of mission creep, where sort of you start off with good intentions, but as time goes by, little things get changed. And then before you know it, suddenly you're publishing books which may not have been your original mission to actually be doing. And I've seen that happen in so many different publishing companies. I guess the same pressures you have as if you're a minister. If you're, you can preach in order to what your heart says you should be preaching, what you're convicted to preach, but there's always that pressure on the outside to give people what they want.
Yep.
And the same thing in publishing, of course, to give people what they want, you're rewarded in money. So the pressure is there when you've got a payroll and everything else to meet, that to actually to drift, I suppose, in that way. So having a board of trustees actually stops us from doing that sort of thing. I mean, if you have family-oriented companies, or if you have companies which have no particular basis of faith, then there's nothing really to stop the next generation from just making a small change or a small different direction, or admitting a new author into the ranks, it were, and before you know it, you're publishing stuff which you really wish you hadn't.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting one, and I would ask you this as a follow-up question to that, because publishing in general is just fascinating to me. Christian books in general are fascinating to me, and I want to speak a little more about the books aspect as well. But typically, it's been my experience that when you find a Christian, they're digging into, especially in Scripture, they're reading more of their Bibles as they should be, and they're digging into these truths. It typically tends to spill into other areas of life. All of us are restricted by the hours in the day. But oftentimes we find ourselves wanting to read, whether it's contemporary authors or authors of the past. Banner of Truth obviously is filling both of those. But as far as selecting authors and selecting works, how does Banner of Truth go about that? Like, what gets promoted, what gets brought forth? Like, what's the service that Banner of Truth is trying to provide to Christians, or to the reader in general in that area?
I mean, we basically we're conviction publishers, so whatever it is that I suppose we have either titles or authors or subject areas which are laid on our heart, and then that's really what we pursue to go and do. We don't usually commission books from outside people. We usually are fairly passive as far as that's concerned, and then we pray over what we receive, and then we decide which of those things we need to publish. That's not entirely every single 100%, but essentially we are a little bit more passive, I suppose, than most other publishers are, because we're not really going out there to chase an author down and to get a book out of them which we know is going to be a success in the marketplace, because that's not our purpose. Our purpose is originally was to keep books alive which were necessary or helpful to people in ministry, and that still is part of what we do. You mentioned about the fact that we do contemporary authors as well. I think this year it's around about 50-50.
Okay.
The people who are still alive, and then people which were published in the past. But of course, because we have a huge back catalogue of things which we're constantly rechurning, we're constantly revamping and putting back out there again, people tend to see us as being publishing the classics, and that's the majority of our books. But we're always coming around again with a new cover design or with a new typesetting or things like that. So people think of us as being sort of like books from the past, really, mainly. But we had to do a fair number of contemporary titles as well.
Right. Yeah, no, that's interesting, because I think most of us, or at least I, came first into contact with Banner of Truth from what you're describing. These were older works that you guys had republished, repackaged. They were in a user-friendly format, so to speak, something that you could actually digest. That's how I first encountered you. And then you come across things like this book we referenced from Venema, which, although I was just noticing, and I was a bit shocked, it's 23 years old already. I still think of this as a contemporary work, which I guess it is still, but that's contemporary, right? It's written in 2000.
I think Keith would recognize himself as being contemporary whilst he's still alive.
Absolutely. No, but that's refreshing to hear, though, because so often with publishing, obviously, even within the most Christian enterprise, there is the bottom line that comes into play at some point, right? People are wondering about, you have to be profitable to stay afloat. I think some of the frustration with a lot of Christian publishers has been the fact that dominates the discussion. In other words, it's only the flashy names, it's the ones that are sure to sell, but the content doesn't seem to come into the conversation a lot on that. It's less important what you wrote, and it's more important how you can sell it. Do you see Banner of Truth kind of against the flow in that regard, if I'm hearing you correctly?
Oh, yeah. I mean, essentially, there are other publishers which have a similar sort of lookout as well. But as you say, the pressure is always there, and the tendency, because the marketplace is always after new titles, then the tendency is to give people what they want, and therefore they want something new. They want something by someone they know. They want a big name author or something like that. And of course, sometimes the content just really isn't there. And I guess we're more in tune with the idea of publishing things which will still be around 100 years' time. You know, a book is not a short-term profit opportunity.
Right.
A Christian book is something which is to inform and help and encourage people in their Christian walk. So,
yeah, something with a longer view, in other words, is what you're
oh
saying.
yeah,
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 that's refreshing in a day and age. I mean, having filled out anybody that's filled out a manuscript proposal, for a publisher, there's been, and I don't know, maybe you can speak more to this than I can, but there's been a recent trend, and it seems to be growing more dominant, where the first 90% of the proposal is how many Twitter followers you have, what sort of conferences can you speak at, and then it's almost like an afterthought at the end, like, oh, by the way, what'd you write on? And that's a bit concerning, I would think.
I mean, even in places where I've worked, we've had that sort of element, looking at your platform
Mm-hmm.
and sort of like asking you how many Twitter followers you have and that sort of thing. Um, but it's usually been at the end of the application form rather than at the beginning.
Right.
We're interested in really what the content is of what you're going to write about and how you're going to write about it and can you write about it.
Right.
Those are the key criteria there, really. But of course, the way in which books are marketed now are very different. I mean, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you got your book, your author interviewed by James Dobson on TV or something like that. And that was the launch point. Or you did advertising campaigns in magazines, which Christians read and things like that. That doesn't really happen now.
Mm.
The way in which we get the name out for something is through social media and emails and things like that. So it's kind of important that it's a help, shall I say, if you actually do have some people who already know who you are.
Mm.
But it's not, from our point of view, it's not the be end all. We've had authors who only have flip phones,
Mm.
and so do not have any social media following whatsoever. But in the end, our viewpoint is, what is the content? Is it helpful? Is it the thing which is going to help the church? And we trust God that basically that will be of help to people.
Right.
So we can take a long-term view. We don't have to say it's got to sell X number of copies in the first few months or things like that for it to be a success, which a lot of publishing companies now, what they'll do is they'll cull books after 6 months.
Right.
And, if your book didn't make it, then suddenly you've got a garage full of books, and and
Goodness.
the publisher has space for their next best-selling title in their warehouse.
Right.
Yeah.
So tell me this. Give me your impression on this, because I mentioned, I think it was before we started recording, that one of my favorite thoughts from Lewis was that people of the book, it tends to produce bookish type people. I've seen some recent pushback against that, specifically from within Christian circles, and specifically maybe even from within academia, within Christian circles, that there's too many books. So you mentioned some of the kind of developments in publishing. You've got ebooks now. You've got a great ease of self-publishing that was not available in decades past. Are there too many books rolling around right now? What's your take on that? Your gut level take on, are we saturated with too many good books? Should we be looking to the past? Like, what's your sense of that?
I mean, there've always been too many books. um, in the sense that, if you look at the sort of things which you really would like to read, there's always like far, far too many which you look at and you glance on your shelf as you go past and you think, I really need to get around to reading that.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't. And those are the ones which you've selected. Of course, there are so many other things which are not. I mean, it is easy to publish now. Anyone can actually, go onto Amazon and they can upload a PDF and they can have a cover design made for them, or they can have even someone doing an audio book for them.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's much easier to publish. But of course, it's never been how easy it is to publish. It's always been, how do you find an audience?
Right.
And that's still the difficult thing. It doesn't matter how professional looking your new self-published book is on Amazon. If no one can get to hear about it, then it's unlikely that you're going to get an audience there. So
right.
So yeah, there may well be an awful lot more books than there were before, but in the end in people's consciousness, probably not, because we only have a capacity for a certain amount of titles we can think of, or authors we can think of, or subjects we want to read about, and that limits really bandwidth of what we can actually take in.
Where do you see? I mean, again, I didn't prepare you for any of these questions, but I'm just thinking toward kind of gleaning from some of your experience within publishing. Where do you see the state of Christian publishing right now? What do you see how about what's encouraging to you within Christian publishing? Because I'm looking kind of from the outside in. I don't work with publishers. I have published books and I've written some articles, but I'm a writer on the outside, sort of kind of looking in on this thing. So you read about things, you read about challenges within Christian publishing, you read that people maybe aren't reading as much as they used to. Those sort of things. What's your sense of that? And specifically, what do you see that's encouraging within the realm of kind of Christian publishing, Christian books right now?
Well, I mean, in terms of encouragement, I mean, how many times have we heard about the death of the paper book and things like that, printed book, and yet it still hasn't happened. 15 years ago, people were talking about the ebook was the death of the paper printed book, and then it's settled down at about 20% of the market, and it tends to be towards the fluffier sort of like fictional end of the market.
Okay.
In terms of ebooks, certainly pastors and people like that have invested a lot in platforms like Logos and Accordance and things like that, and that's probably got them a huge library of digital books which they can refer to and look at and things like that. So there is I think people have more books than they used to have. I remember once years ago, I was at a conference and I was interviewing, it's a pastor's conference, I was interviewing people about how many textbooks or source books they had for each book of the Bible when they were preaching on a particular book of the Bible. Mm-hmm. And the number one primary source book which people use was Matthew Henry's commentary, single volume commentary. I was at the same event about 10 years later, did the same thing, and people on average had 9 books for each book of the Bible, which they used as a source. Some of those might have been digital, but essentially people just had a much wider range of resources they were using to preach and to teach. So that's an encouragement, I think, in many ways, as long as we can engage people with the primary sources and not just become people who sound good because they can look around that they can pick up from their digital sources or things like that, the things which sound good in the pulpit, but which don't necessarily indicate that you've actually engaged with the original text. You mentioned Lewis. Lewis was very frustrated with the way in which people never used to engage in source text. They was engaged in secondary texts.
Right.
And that still is a danger, as it were. But if we've got more availability of original text, then overall, I think that probably tends towards people being able to engage more with the original source materials. So that's an encouragement, I feel.
That is a huge encouragement. And especially when you think about, you've mentioned some of the work Banner of Truth has done. You look at the Puritans, you look at, even some of the, going back through all the centuries, I have access right now to people that were just simply not available to generations before me. That's whether I make good use, like you said, whether I make good use of those resources or not. But I have the availability to do so, which seems like a huge plus. What sort of things is Banner of Truth working on? Give us a little peek behind the veil, so to speak. We were talking a little bit before, and you mentioned one on the Puritan hope, which I'd love for you to talk a little more about. But what sort of things are in the works right now for Banner of Truth?
Before I go there, I'd just like to go back to something that you said earlier, which is talking about an encouragement, which is when the Banner started in the 1950s, the reason why we started publishing books is because you just could not get hold of books. You had to rummage around in secondhand bookshops to be able to find the sort of things which you wanted or needed in order to get a rounded picture of a biblical text or a particular subject or things like that. And I look to today, we were basically the only people doing this sort of thing. But look today, you've got other major publishers in the Christian sphere, publishing Puritan authors and doing good editions of Puritan texts of one kind or another. You even have populist publishers who have no particular theological bent, publishing people like J.C. Ryle, or so there's, if you like, a trickling down of Puritan works and Reform works into more general publishers, which we haven't really seen before. Now, in the past, if you're a Reformed publisher in the past, you can almost expect people to send their books to you to publish. Whereas now there's probably about 6, 7, 8 different publishers vying for that particular author's work. So there's a much greater, if you like, dissemination of good books throughout, if you like, Christian publishing. The danger, of course, is always how is that just going to be a short-term thing where people are looking to make a buck, or is it something which is instilled into the DNA, as it were, of publishing companies?
Right.
So yeah, I mean, nowadays, if I was wanted to go and find books on by John Owen or something like that, then I can find it in a variety of different forms, in a variety of different places, which I never would have done in the past. So
right.
Yeah,
I mean, it's not uncommon at all now I mean, most guys, I mean, I just got off the phone with a guy, and in the background there was the full set of John Owen. I think he had Thomas Manton right beside it. You know, those that's a tremendous aid that is now widely available. No, that's good to bring up. Peek behind the veil, if you don't mind. What is Banner of Truth cranking on right now? Like what sort of projects are in the hopper right now?
Oh, well, I mean, we're continuing basically with the themes of finding, if you like, sets and works of books which have been not at the forefront of people's minds in the past. So we've just done the works of William Bridge, which is something which had not been available for people, things like that. But also in terms of contemporary books, I think one which we just recently I've been very excited about is Jonathan Landry Cruz did a book for us called The Character of Christ. And it's just a lovely, lovely book. It's one of those books where you start to read it and you stop and you underline and you write notes in the sides of it and things like that to come back to later on. You want to read it twice, you want to read it 3 times, sort of thing. So that's a very small, slight book, but it's such a valuable sort of book in that sense. And we love doing books like that. We love doing books which people want to go back to, which is more than just okay, that was fun, but what has changed in my life as a result of that? Has it really extended my understanding of anything? Right. Or is it just something which is stuff which I'd known before, things like that. In terms of other things which we're sort of like trying to do, we do have some. I have one book in the future I'm not allowed to tell you about. But
give us a hint. Give us a hint underneath the radar.
All I tell you is that Iain Murray is working on a book at the moment, which will be very well received when it comes out. But
fantastic.
But that's all I can say.
Fair enough.
As far as that at the moment. No, we're continuing really to work with things like we've become fairly famous for things like Valley of Vision and for Puritan or Puritanesque devotional books, and so we continue to do those. So Refreshment for the Soul by Richard Sibbes was a recent one we did like that, which is someone contemporary editing the works of Richard Sibbes, but make it into a daily devotional book. And the difficulty with that is that quite a few people have attempted that, but what tends to happen is that it reads just like someone's taken the sermons of someone and they've chopped it up into different sections. You know, each individual day does not stand on its own as being something to. So it's a good editorial, as it were, ability to be able to do that. So Sibbes is one of those examples of Refreshment for the Soul, whereby every single page looks like it's actually been designed to be read that way, as a daily devotional, and not just today's installment of a serial, as it were.
Right.
So we're continuing doing that sort of thing, which is encouraging. Once again, it just brings back some of these authors to people's minds in a different format, which they might accept, a daily devotional format, whereas they might not want to have read, a 200, 300, 400-page book by Sibbes, or even think about getting into it, as it were. Right. So yeah, we're still trying to find interesting ways of giving people on-ramps to the Puritans, if I can put it that way.
I think it's what's so interesting with the Puritans, and of course that's a broad brushstroke term, but in general, my experience has been I'm excited, or not excited. Maybe I have expedient expectations when I see the length of the book, and then, like you said, I find myself on page 7 still making notes and still thinking about things and dwelling on it. They're so rich and dense. in the material. Tell us a little bit about the Puritan hope that's coming out, because I suspect many of the people that might watch this channel would be familiar with that work. Can you give us a little insight into that project?
It's a project which we've done before. I think I've got a copy of the paperback original on my shelf. I think it was originally written in the 1970s. But it's one which is one of our continuous, if you like, books in demand. And so we're bringing another version of it out later on this year. I think next month, towards the end of next month, middle of next month. But that's a book which really tends to be used by people because it is such it brings together so many different disparate elements, as it were, looking at prophecy and things like that,
right?
And trying to explain, as it were, make sense of that into the Christian's life nowadays. I mean, one of the problems which we have often is that Puritans in general didn't really write a lot of eschatological works in one sense. There's a lot of stuff which has eschatological implications, but generally speaking, they were more concerned with if like theological experience. Lewis mentioned Lewis earlier. Lewis used to contrast the in his 16th was it Oxford, basically his book about 16th century writings and things like that. He used to contrast the reformers who were interested in doctrine with the Puritans who were interested in experience and doctrine, as it were. And so it's great to be able to look at the things which have if you like, eschatological things, which then have an impact in our lives nowadays. And I think that's, generally speaking, the sort of books which we do tend to be like that. They're not so much interested in whether or not there's a particular position being taken in terms of post-millennial, premillennial, whatever, amillennial. They're more interested in what is the meaning of the text, and therefore how does that have an impact back in my life. We're mentioning Colossians chapter 3 earlier, which is a passage, verses 1 to 4 is a passage which talks about, if you like, where our vision should be. But then verse 5 comes straight back and says, so therefore we should be, how do we apply this to our lives now?
Right.
And so I think the tendency of our books is that I looked around just to try and find, which books we actually have which really deal particularly with eschatological, if like, systems and things like that. And we don't really do a tremendous number of them because we tend to focus more upon the Puritan view of how does experiential theology, how does the experience of Christian life, how does that actually come back to this?
Right.
Yeah,
I think that's been, for a lot of us that have encountered the Puritans, you expect maybe more of a systematized view, maybe something a little more categorically sussed out in their theology, or their eschatology rather, and you don't get that, like you said. And yet the hope of Christ's coming, the confidence in what he is doing in this world, all of that is just palpable. It's flowing through, but it's deeply devotional. As you said, it's deeply impactful for their lives. Yeah. I think that's one thing that's been encouraging about a lot of the things that Banner of Truth, among others, have brought out from those writers is the value of eschatology. It's not just an ivory tower endeavor. It's something that's deeply impactful, or it should be, at least we could say. Tell me this. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah, I find it interesting that it's only when you get to like the Swiss and the Dutch that you actually get a more systemized approach. And of course, then they tend to become amillennial. So just there seems to be a case of soon systematic theologians tend to sort of drift in that direction for some reason. But there we go.
Interesting.
I'm not an expert on such things, so I'm not going to get myself in hot water.
No, that's fascinating. Tell me this, Mr. Thompson, because I do appreciate your time today. But where can people keep up with what Banner of Truth has going on? Or I don't know if maybe you're on social media, or if we already mentioned social media, so I know it's a double-edged sword. But where can they keep up with what Banner of Truth has going on and the projects that are coming out?
I mean, the easiest way is really just to sign up to our emails. If you go onto our website, it'll probably ask you within about 10 seconds whether you want to sign up for on our website, whether you want to sign up for emails or not. But Either sign up for those or for SMS text messaging or things like that. And then we won't flood you with information. We'll send you an email, usually about once a week, something like that. Just tells you about some books which we have, some new titles, some plans which we have, which you might want to be involved with. But I think it is important to remember that Banner is not just actually a book publisher. We've always been involved. We started as a magazine publisher, and the magazine which we started in 1955 is still going.
Oh wow!
So basically, it's good if we'll give you an opportunity to sign up and get some into, if you like, some free copies of that, some digital copies of that, or things like that, so you can get started on it. But yeah, reading the magazine is a good way of actually keeping track with sort of where a lot of our authors and a lot of the thinking which we're doing as well. And also conferences. We've ministers' conferences as well.
Yep.
So we always have 4 strings to our bow, we say here, which is we have book publishing, we have magazine publishing, we have conferences, and we also have the book fund, which was started 1960s in response to someone reading about Susanna Spurgeon, who you may or may not know. Susanna Spurgeon, she sold, I think, her coin collection so that she could get copies of lectures to my students, her husband's book, out to Baptist pastors who were not able to afford them. And I think she managed to get 100 and something books out initially to various people. And someone inside the Banner was so inspired by that, they said, we should do a book fund too. So we have a book fund which people can contribute to, and we get books out to people who otherwise can't afford them. Not just overseas, but also inside the United States as well, and Canada. So
that's a fantastic idea. I did not know of that fund. That's great.
Oh yeah, I mean, sometimes it's if you look at what people are buying on the back side of the website, then sometimes the book fund is like the 3rd or the 4th most popular thing that people have bought. They put money into it and things like that.
Right.
So it's a great encouragement to people. It means that we've been able to stock libraries in Africa and Asia. It means that we've been able to get books to ministers in far-flung places who just haven't had the opportunity to have good books at their disposal. Yeah. I said earlier about pastors in America only having Matthew Henry's single volume commentary as being their main source material for their sermons and teaching. But, in many places in the world, they would love to have that.
Yep.
So if we can provide a nice balanced range of books for people's purposes, then that's great.
No, that's fantastic. And I mean, just kind of now I'm feeling a bit guilt ridden because I have books on my shelf that are, as everybody does, that are waiting to be read, right? I have that luxury of having a few books I haven't even put my eyes to yet. And sometimes you forget that's it's wealth. It's a blessing that we're provided with. There's a lot of pastors out there that don't have that. So that's great to hear about. I'm glad you brought that up. So banneroftruth.com or .org that people can go there.
Banneroftruth.org. Go there, join up our email list, and then we'll keep you informed about what we're doing. That's a good way of doing it. But also follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, things like that.
Very good.
Not Threads yet.
From what I hear, I don't think Threads is keeping up steam, so you might not have to worry about getting on there.
Because one of the dangers of being involved in social media is there's always a new kid on the block, and always the question is, well, do we invest in this or don't we invest in this? And generally speaking, it's one of those time things.
Right. So no banner of truth TikTok at this point. Am I hearing you correctly?
No, there's not at the moment. I mean, the one of the issues, though, of course, is that if you look at the way in which people communicate, especially younger people, interesting, if you look at the profile of who it is who actually buys Banner and communicates with us, then I think our second largest group of people is in the 25 to 34 age range. Our largest one is in the 35 to 44 age range. But there's, I think, 60% of our people are under the age of 45.
Okay.
Something like that. But the big empty area is younger people below 25. So the question is, how do you communicate with those people? And they're communicating through YouTube, or they're communicating through TikTok or things like that. So always the problem is how do we how do we somehow communicate with these people whilst at the same time not compromising on things?
Mm-hmm.
Not that I'm particularly bothered about whether China actually knows what we're doing, but as far as I'm concerned, the more they know about what we're doing, the better, in one sense.
Right. Well, if I see Puritan TikToks floating around out there, I expect some sort of credit on the bottom there for the idea. But
okay, right, yeah, we can gladly do that.
No, Mr. Thompson, thank you so much for joining us. Please be sure to check out Banner of Truth and keep up what they're doing. But again, thank you so much for your time today and for your partnership with our ministry.
No, it's good to be with you. Good to see what you're doing, and it's very interesting to see how it'll develop.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Seated here at my right hand, the Lord to my Lord did command, for of these heathen I will make a kingly footstool for your sake.